Hi, everyone, and welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. Today, we are blessed to have Jer Swigart back with us. Jer is co-founder of Global Immersion, a nonprofit that equips leaders to live as everyday peacemakers in the world. Jer is a Pepperdine Leadership Fellow, a Senior Fellow at the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute. He holds an MDiv from Fuller Theological Seminary and a Doctor of Leadership in Global Perspectives from Portland Seminary. Jer is also the co-author of Mending the Divides, Creative Love in a Conflicted World, and co-host with the fantastic Oshita Moore of Journey of Hope, a 6-month immersion in practicing peacemaking in real-world settings, which is where we met because I participated in Journey of Hope last year and absolutely loved it. Some of you may remember that I interviewed Jer before, exactly a year ago, in fact, on the topic of peacemaking as a spiritual practice. And I wanted to have Jer back on the show now because if we thought that it was bad a year ago in terms of needing peacemakers in the world, it certainly feels like it's worse now. There's a real on the edge of the cliff feeling globally. There's so much division and so much conflict around us that it does absolutely feel like everyone has a role in pulling us out of the precarious place that we find ourselves in, both for this generation and for the generations to come. We all have to be peacemakers now. And so today, Jer and I are going to talk about how to engage and disengage from conversations with love, what nonviolent peacemaking looks like in today's world, following Jesus outside the walls of the church, and how to discern what is yours to do now. And whatever else we get into, you never know where the conversation is going to go when we get together. So, Jer, thank you so much once again for being here. It's so great to see you again.
Absolutely. Great to be here.
Well, we've been meaning to do this interview for some time. I was joking before we hit record that having Jer on the podcast is really the only time I get to see him these days. But one of the things that made me feel like I really want to do this interview with you now, have this conversation with you now, is again, it feels like we all have a part to play, as you say in your book, in mending the divide of our conflicted world. Not everybody is going to go to Pakistan and broker peace deals like you did. If you don't know that story, buy Jer's book. But I want to start where I think is the lowest hanging fruit for all of us, and that is with the everyday conversations that we have in our own lives. How to engage and disengage with these conversations with love. And so let's just start there. Really simple.
Yeah.
How do you know? Yeah, I know, simple and not so simple. How do you know when to engage and when to disengage in a conversation that could be difficult now?
Yeah, I mean, let me ask a clarifying question back for you. Are we talking about in the context of a pre-existing relationship, or in the context of like this conversation is finding you somewhere?
Pre-existing
Right
relationship
on. Okay,
and a
yeah, because
relationship that you want to keep.
yeah, good. Yeah, because that's where we live, right? Like we always talk about how peacemaking, is often misunderstood as the role of professional humanitarians and politicians and pastors and things like that. No, it's for all of us because conflict finds us. Conflict is inevitable, and part of what we're trying to help people recognize is with the inevitability of conflict, it's also a great opportunity for our collective transformation, the deepening of relationship. I think that our relationship can be stronger and more beautiful if we navigate through the conflict than trying to walk around it, you know? And so the front lines of conflict, we're all navigating them sometimes on a daily basis. And it often doesn't look like a war zone. It looks like that disagreement with someone you love. So the rubber meets the road of peacemaking in our everyday relationships. And I think, Emily, we've watched, you know, especially since probably 2015 and on, a massive disintegration of core relationships. You know, mothers and daughters and friend groups and faith communities are disintegrating. People are reorganizing themselves because of disagreement and their inability to handle it into relationships where I can just be more comfortable with folk who are like-minded with me. And on one hand, that makes a lot of sense. It's easier to be in relationship with folk with whom we already agree. On the other hand, I really think that it's diminishing our ability to see the humanity in those that we disagree with. I think it's diminishing our capacity for compassion. You know, I think it's making our sense of certainty more rigid, which actually makes us more defensive and more combative. And so the skills of navigating disagreement or conflict are actually atrophying in us as we find ourselves surrounded by sameness. So the question that I think you're asking is critical because I think one of the most hopefully alternative ways that we can live in the world right now is actively pursuing relationships with folk with whom we disagree, and especially that needs to start within our wingspan, within the everyday relationships. I think there's I have kind of a spidey sense around, is this moment is there potential for transformation in this moment? Not theirs. I'm usually asking, is there potential for transformation for me? I can't transform anybody. I can't convince. I think we're beyond the era of rational persuasion. I'm not going to convince anybody of the superiority of my ideas anymore. And so I'm more committed right now to transformation and connection than agreement. And so I think that's some of what I'm bringing into the front lines of interpersonal conflict right now. I want to become a better version of myself. I want my circle of human concern, as John A. Powell talks about at Cal Berkeley. I want my circle of human concern to expand and to keep expanding. And so when conflict finds me, I want to see it as an opportunity for transformation, but also I want to see it as an opportunity for deepened connection. I want to give this moment the benefit of the doubt that we could strengthen the fabric of our friendship in the midst of this. So I'm vetting the moment on potential for transformation, potential for connection. If I sense that the person is coming at me combatively, I'm recognizing right away that their lid is already flipped and they're thinking with their amygdala. They want to fight, and I'm not gonna be transformed, nor find deeper connection if we're both operating out of our reptilian brains. And so my tactic right now is to figure out how quickly can I re-engage their executive function. And there are some ways that I think that are really effective to do that. The first is to not be intimidated by the intensity of their feelings, the heat of their words, the fierceness in their eyes. I'm not gonna be intimidated by that. I'm gonna hold my ground, but I'm not gonna do it combatively. I think that's really important. Secondly, I'm going to affirm as quickly as I can anything that I can affirm. So if a loved one comes up to me and they're hot, I mean, I can tell that they're ready to scrap, they're ready to brawl on a thing. Then one of the first things I'm probably going to say is, I can see that you feel really deeply or really strongly about this. Right. So there's all sorts of different ways. I could say something like, wow, you're angry, or clearly you're mad, or, you know, I could use my words in that moment to actually dump fuel on the passion and the fire, or I can affirm what's to affirm. And I'm affirming in this moment, you feel strongly about a thing. I resonate with that. I feel strongly about things. It's amazing when we start with affirmation, when we hold our ground and then we start with affirmation, how it's disarming and it starts to re-engage that executive function because I want them thinking rationally, not in a fight or flight kind of orientation. And then the third thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to hold my ground. I'm gonna affirm what I can, and then I'm going to ask a question that leads them to story. And because we're not going to have a constructive dialogue at this point around words. And because all that's going to happen is people are going to start trafficking their talking points, their progressive and their conservative talking points with one another, or their side, or their perspectives. I want to understand that eventually, but I'm not going to start there. What I want to do is I want to get to the story behind why they feel as strongly as they feel about that. And so, again, I'm going to hold my ground. I'm going to affirm you feel strongly about that. I can resonate with this. Help me understand when this first started for you. Can you tell me the story of when this first started to matter to you? Right. And in so doing, I'm taking them off their script and off their talking points. And I'm inviting them to actually dig a little bit deeper into their own life and their own story to say, well, here's when it began for me. And what happens is as they begin to tell a story, their executive function is re-engaging. You see, there's a biology behind peacemaking, right? They're starting to re-engage their executive function because story does that. And all of a sudden, I'm not like trying to process their talking points. Now I'm actually making a connection with a human being. And from there, we can actually make our way back to the talking points or back to the issue at hand. So that's that in shorthand. That's how I kind of vet what's going on. Now, if I don't sense, I'm gonna hold my ground, and if they posture a little bit more, that's gonna be an indicator to me. If when I affirm, like I feel you, I sense that you feel really strongly about this. If the response there is combative, it's probably not a right, like the iron is too hot in that moment for a constructive conversation. So at that moment, I might say something like, this is really important to me. I don't think that now is the time to have the conversation. I don't think that I'd be able to care for you or me well in this conversation. So again, I'm owning my desire to care for myself and for you well. I want to know where you're coming from, and it doesn't seem like now is the right time for it. Can we circle back around? Right. So I'm keeping the door open. Now is not the right time, clearly, but I'm keeping the door open for when the time is better for us to explore this.
You said something a minute ago about we have gone beyond the age of rational persuasion. And that's an interesting phrase, and it feels really true. We're not going to, unfortunately, it doesn't seem like we're able to reason one another into new positions these days. And
Mhm.
so we have to get underneath it, try something new, get underneath it with connection.
That's right.
And I guess this is a good time to bring in something that you talked about when we did Journey of Hope, which is that you'll have to unpack it for us. But what I remember is you showed a slide of an iceberg, and the top of the iceberg was what the other person is showing you in terms of their ideology and their position. And yet, underneath what you can see is all the layers of
Mhm.
why that position matters so much and how it was formed.
Yeah.
And I think that really encapsulates what you're trying to say here in terms of, okay, let's get beyond the top position
Yeah.
to the stories underneath and how that position was shaped. So can you talk about
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
iceberg model?
Yeah, you bet. I imagine a whiteboard behind me, and there's an iceberg drawn on it. And as you know, an iceberg, about 20 or 30% of an iceberg is above the waterline, and between 70 and 80% is below the waterline. And so that's why it's a helpful illustration for me in these interpersonal dynamics. What I get to see and what we see, what we observe, what we experience are the words and the behaviors. That's what's on top of the iceberg, or on top of the waterline. Their words and their behaviors. And yeah, and what I'm finding just in my own practice is like folk are really shored up for the most part on their talking points. Or if there's been harm, if the relationship is wounded or interrupted, there's a really significant book of stories that people have crafted. I would say they fabricated fables about the words and the behaviors that they've experienced, and those talking points are really firm. And yeah, I don't remember the last time I sat down with somebody where the iron was a little warm or a little hot, and we both laid out our talking points, and a person, me or the other person, was like, "Oh, you know what? Like, I was wrong, and you were right." Like, it's just not really, it's not happening outside of the context and the slow, inconvenient pace of relationship right now. It's just not the way that we're operating as a society from my point of view. So what I'm trying to help people understand is, okay, above the waterline, you've got words and behaviors. It's actually not helpful to engage there. Right below the waterline are what I would call ideologies and theologies. So, or some would call these worldviews. But it's the political ideologies that go hand in hand, are oftentimes fused with theologies. Our ideologies are often in search of theologies because we need God to justify the way that we see the world. So like ideologies and theologies are kind of the yin and yang right below the waterline. We don't get to see their ideology. We don't get to see their theology, but we hear about it in their words. We see it in their behaviors, right? But most people aren't consciously competent in their ideology and theology. So it's actually not helpful to have a conversation, I don't think, around ideology and theology. Below ideology and theology are values and fears, and because we've all got them, and chances are, if I'm sitting with somebody who is my ideological other, I've done this long enough to recognize that once we actually get to a place of talking about values, we share a lot of them. We manifest them differently, but we share a lot of values. And that's the great surprise in this work. But again, most people don't, they can't say, here are my 5 driving values. And fear has some shame connotation. So people, it feels very vulnerable to talk about your fears. So people they're not gonna talk about, but you can hear probably some of their fears. You can observe some of their values in their words and their behaviors that above the waterline. Right. But I'm probably not going to try to meet them at values and fears right away. So again, words and behaviors above the waterline, ideologies and theologies below the waterline. Below that are the values and the fears that have actually shaped the ideologies in search for theological justification. And then below the values and the fears are the stories. They're the experiences. They're the relationships that have shaped the values and informed the fears. Right? This is where I want to get people to. I want to get them to the base of that iceberg as quickly as possible. They're not automatically going to go there. They need to actually be guided there. So again, I experience, I listen to the ideology, I watch the behavior that it might be offensive to me or troubling, or I might disagree really significantly. I'm not going to start with my disagreement with you. I'm going to start with wonder. I want to know the stories behind why and how you feel this deeply about a thing. When did that begin for you? Right? And it's when we bring them there that, again, the executive function tends to re-engage. They start to remember their own humanity. They're story-formed people, right? They're not talking points. They're not bullet points. They're not scripted. They're actually human beings that have been shaped by experience. And as I begin to hear their story, all it does is grow my compassion and empathy, and it deepens my understanding. If you experience that, oh, then yeah, that if I would have experienced that, I might feel that way too. right? And all of a sudden, there's some empathy that's introduced into the conversation. And we're at a very different place already in the conversation or in the conflict.
I was going to ask you about how to de-escalate when someone's in that place at the top of the iceberg, where it's just about their words, their behaviors, and their theology, their ideas,
Yeah.
that are oftentimes very fixed.
Yeah.
How do you get them to the base of the iceberg? But it sounds like
Yeah.
you're saying you ask questions.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
ask them to get below their to get to those
Yeah.
stories. So if somebody finds themselves in a situation where they really want to de-escalate, what would you tell them would be like the go-to thing to do or say in that situation?
Well, I think it's the unseen stuff that I'd like to comment on first. It's what is the work that we have done as human beings to show up and be present when conflict finds us. Right. So, again, if we could actually embrace the reality that conflict is inevitable, it's going to find you today. Like it's not, it's going to find you today. And again, for me, conflict is the collision of opposing ideas, actions, or words that destabilize a status quo. It's going to happen today, right? And so, if conflict is inevitable, it's important for us to become anchored and propelled people, so that when it finds us, I don't have to like do some kind of, okay, what's my strategy again? When conflict finds me, I already want to be the kind of person who's anchored in that moment.
That's really interesting because I hear you, right? It's not about like, what's the tip and trick? What's the thing that I need to say right now to de escalate this situation? If you have the presence of mind, you automatically de escalate the situation in part non-verbally, right?
That's
Like
right.
you're not
Yes.
overreacting. And that comes from my perspective, that comes from a deep rooted faith and
That's
training of
yes.
one's own mind.
That's right.
And so I'm curious as to I know you have been in a lot of situations, heightened tensions, great conflict. You were standing in front of ice vans before anyone really even knew what they were.
Hmm.
And so I'm curious as to how your faith has informed your ability to de-escalate
Yeah.
conflict.
Yeah, yeah, really good. I mean, the my faith is the high octane fuel behind my presence, I hope. And I hope that I'm always on a journey of discovering more fully a faith that's worth my life. It's not a fixed faith for me, it's an evolving faith, you know, and I come from the Jesus tradition, and I look at the creative, costly, sacrificial way of Jesus as the pathway toward repair, as the as an ideal, and that's what I want. I want my life to be formed around that. And I'll just maybe point to a couple pieces of the Jesus that centers my faith that I think helps me show up in these moments. First and foremost, there's this moment where Jesus is baptized, and the gospel writers say that the heavens were severed, which means that there's a new access to God in this moment. It's interesting. Something new has happened. The Spirit descends in the form of a dove, which is like the symbol of peace, which means that the activity of God on the planet is the remaking of a broken world. And and then the third thing that happens is a voice from the heaven says, "Behold, this is my beloved." And what I find remarkable about that is that Jesus is declared beloved before he had even done anything. So, in other words, like our belovedness isn't earned. God loves us because God wants to, period. And that is an unspeakable reality. And for me, it's not just about embracing my own belovedness. I'm loved because God wants to, not because I can achieve something or seduce God's attention or affection in some way. I'm loved because God wants to. And if that's true about me, guess who that's also true of? My neighbor, my other, my enemy, right? Believe it or not, the person who exists beyond the reach of my empathy is as beloved by God as I am.
Now you're
Uh,
talking course language
Ooh, come
because
on. See, we're woven together, my friends. So like you see what I'm saying? So
yeah.
that's the bedrock for me in all of this. I think secondly, Jesus was diametrically magnificently opposed to any system, structure, theology, policy that dignified some while denigrating others. And you see it across the board in the life of Jesus. Any social norm that sought to diminish the belovedness of another, Jesus disrupted that. And so I think that for me, like there's the nature of peacemaking as building a clear analysis, and peacemaking often is disruptive. Peacekeeping means that we maintain unjust status quos. Peacemaking oftentimes looks like we stand in direct opposition to any system, theology, ideology that dignifies some while denigrating others. Now, the way that Jesus did that never harmed a person. There was an invitation, but there was a significant truth telling to how Jesus showed up in those moments. So that's super significant to me. And then I think third, like, the way of sacrifice paved the way for repair. And like I don't anticipate that the work of peacemaking in my life is going to be comfortable. I anticipate that it's going to be costly. And so there's a there's like for me, like if I take seriously a God who put on flesh and entered into a broken reality, a conflicted reality, maybe even enemy territory, as some of the New Testament writers say. And he did it equipped with compassion and curiosity rather than a conquering orientation. And then invites us to do the same. It helps me understand that my faith isn't about believism. My faith should actually cause me to move toward the points of pain in the world, whether it's internally, interpersonally, or institutionally, with the tools to heal rather than to win. So, like my faith, like I said, is the high octane fuel behind my peacemaking work. And so, for me, the contemplative work is not about seducing God's attention or proving how spiritual I am. My contemplative work is about embracing my belovedness again because I know what it's like when I show up on the planet not convinced of my belovedness. Because what I'm going to do today, if I'm not convinced of my belovedness, is I'm going to use you to achieve what I already have. That's what
Hmm.
we do, right? If we start to lose sight of our own belovedness, we try to earn what we already have. And every time we try to earn what we already have, we hurt people. So my contemplative work is about embracing my belovedness again so that when conflict finds me, when I'm looking at that person, I want the impulse. And this is a lifelong journey. I haven't honed this with any level of perfection, but I want to be at a place that when conflict finds me, I'm looking with soft eyes at the person across from me, recognizing, I'm beloved and so are they. It starts there, right? And that looping it to your original question, Em, like that reality is so disarming for me. It shapes my posture. It shapes the look of my face. It shapes the sound of my voice. It turns me into a gracious host rather than a combatant in the moment. And there's very few things that disarm another person than that kind of posture. And that starts with a mindset or a heart set, I think.
It does. Yeah. And it's funny because so much of what you're saying, as I just mentioned, is course like. In the course, we are viewing other people with holiness, equality, and worth, not because of what they've done, but because of who they are as God created them.
Hmm.
And so they're worthy of love
Yeah.
and worthy of our care because they are God's creation
Yeah.
just like we are.
That's right.
And I love the overlap between what you that's part of why I joined Journey of Hope and part of why I love Global Immersion, your organization, so much is because I see so much overlap in what you're teaching with what I believe as a student of A Course in
Yeah.
Miracles. And I genuinely feel like the way forward is for cross conversation
Yeah.
between those who have shared values in creating a better world.
Hmm.
Now, my question for you is it feels like Christianity has been co-opted, hijacked
Hmm. Hmm.
in many very fundamental ways by a a faith that does want to dominate and is very muscular in its
Hmm.
presentation, and Jesus is not this peace-loving
Hmm.
figure.
Hmm.
He has become somewhat of a mascot for domination.
Hmm.
And so,
Hmm.
how do you square that Jesus of your faith with the Jesus of your heart?
Yeah. Oh, so well said. You're poetic, my friend. I I mean, I grew up between a dairy farm and a military base in Midwest Wisconsin and inherited a religion that posited God as a warrior. And I remember having a conversation with some of the military personnel in my hometown where they understood the U.S. military as God's righteous right hand. And sometimes it's an open hand and sometimes it's a fist. I traded Desert Storm cards. Like back in 1991, they created like baseball cards around war. And it was like Norman Schwarzkopf and like the Tomahawk missile and like the aircraft carriers and all. I had the complete set, and we would like trade these and collect Colin Powell and things like this. So part of me, Emily, like I have to root it in my own story that there was a faith that I inherited that was an orientation toward domination, and the people, including my incredible family, my parents, like that's not the language that was used necessarily. It's all they knew, and this it was a religion that had been co-opted where there was no daylight between what it meant to be a conservative American and a Christian. And so like part my journey has been a journey from a religion that dominates to a faith that restores. And what I'm recognizing is that a religion that dominates costs the lives of way too many. One is too many. But the faith of Jesus, the tradition of Jesus is about repair. It's actually a sacrificial way of life. It's a costly way of life for the sake of others. They're very different things, very different entities and realities. And so it's rooted in my own story, which actually I've gone on a long journey of being really, really judgmental and angry, outraged, and but part of my journey then has taken me to a place of empathy because these are my people, this is my family, and I think that we live in a world right now where too many of us think that we get the world we want through force rather than friendship. So rather than reaching across difference into relationship with these folk, too many of us think we're just going to build power with people who already think like us, and we're going to, build this collective over here. And what happens is we become very judgmental. Like, and if you're a progressive person, the way that I've paid attention to this in the last 5 or 10 years is progressive people of faith, care about black and brown folk now and gay folk and everything. But you know who we hate? We hate conservative evangelicals now. That's not righteous. You see what I'm saying? And so
Mhm.
so John A. Powell, again in the Circle of Human Concern, the Center of Othering and Belonging at Cal Berkeley, He talks about the expanding of the circle of human concern. And my play on that is what's happening in the world right now is that too many of us are just shifting our circle of human concern. We care about these people now. Good. But if you hate them, like what have we accomplished?
Right.
Right. And so anyway, some thoughts on this. The last thing that I just want to bring to bear, I guess, for this conversation is I like a malformed Christianity, and I just wrote a piece on Charlie Kirk, martyrdom, and our religion of power. And maybe we can pop that link in here on the Hopeful Alternative Substack, where I reflect on this a little bit, and because this is not a new phenomenon. This is the way that I think about it is this is the Christianity that washed up on our colonial shores, friends. It was a fusion of religion and politic that was centered on greed and racism and violence. That was the Christianity that washed up on our shores. And of course, there have always been alternative movements that have oriented themselves around a cross wearing rather than a cross wielding God. But the dominant expression of religion was imperial.
Hmm.
It was power, sit on the throne of power. And if you look at the manifestation of that movement from the willful genocide of our indigenous population to plantation capitalism the enslavement of our African kin, that's the manifestation of that faith. This isn't a new phenomenon. That faith manifests itself and then it built an institution and then it's created pipelines from children's ministries to youth ministries to Christian universities to seminaries to build the leaders to perpetuate what I would call is a malformed Christianity. Now, that's not helpful language when I'm talking to somebody who has an orientation toward domination. So like I'm not because it can make me sound like, oh well, I'm enlightened, and oh wow, I've been on such a journey, and whoa, I have such a wide circle of human concern. I just think I'm trying to be honest that there are different Jesuses that are being co-opted to defend our preferences. And if the Jesus that you follow, or if the faith that you've designed for yourself endorses your accumulation of power, wealth, and safety at high cost to others, it's an illegitimate faith. It's an illegitimate theology, especially if you claim it to be somewhat Christian. That is just not what Jesus looks like, and I think it's important to talk about that. I think it's important to tell the truth about that, but not in a way that slams doors, in a way that actually invites a deeper, like let's explore this together, and I think that that's the real challenge right now.
So many things that I want to touch on. I'm not even quite sure where to start, but I'll start here. I'm reading a book right now that I'm really enjoying. It's called Separation of Church and Hate by John Fugelsang. I don't know if you've heard
I
of
haven't
it.
read it.
One of the things that he says in that book is if you're in a church that is not telling you to love your enemies, but is constantly telling you who your enemies are, you're not in a church. And so one of the things that has been disheartening to me is when you take something like Sermon on the Mount, one of the, if not the most beautiful teaching to touch planet Earth, and you present it in a evangelical church, the
Hmm.
response is often blowback, like, where did you get these liberal talking points? And so I'm curious, I hear you on don't just shift your hate from one group to another. That's not going to help anyone. But I am curious because you have your ear to the ground more in the Christian community than we do as course students.
Hmm.
Where do you stand? I want to say, are you hopeful? But where do you stand on this version of Jesus making its way through, the version that you were talking about, where
Mm.
he is a unconditionally loving disruptor of systems that dominate?
Yeah. Yeah, good question. I mean, I oscillate between hope and despair, to be honest. N- like honestly, there are moments where I am literally I'm losing loved ones, right? I'm watching things crumble that will have generational impact, negative impact. All of this endorsed by this religion of domination that posits itself as Christianity. I listen to the endorsements of draconian, dehumanizing policy by people who claim Jesus, and I'm like that. It just could not be further from the
Who you
Jesus
know
of
him
the
to be.
yeah, the Jesus of the even of the Jesus of the scriptures. Like you have to ignore so much of Jesus to to construct a Jesus that endorses the accumulation of power at expense to another. Like it's just you have to do some kind of twisted spiritual jujitsu to imagine a Jesus that way. But we've become so efficient at doing that. Here's how I'd interact with that, Emily. Like I think that Jesus over time has always broken through. But the point of Jesus was never to become the global religion. I don't think. I don't think Jesus came to start a religion, frankly. I think Jesus came to demonstrate a way of life and invited us into the rhythms of that with him. And then shaped community around that. And where I think we've misunderstood, one of the ways we've misunderstood Jesus is that he's built a religion that will conquer the world. And I watch Jesus like literally look at people and say, "Hey, if you're not like really up for the way of cross-shaped love, okay, that's okay. Like come back if and we'll talk more." When like Jesus didn't try to convince anybody of anything, and he certainly didn't wield power to try to coerce folk. And so the way of Jesus has always thrived in the margins, never on the thrones of power.
Hmm.
And so, like, I'm not interested actually in a conversation around building a new moral majority to displace the current moral majority with maybe a more God looking Jesus. I'm actually interested in the movement that has always been underway, and that's a movement of the remnant. It's the subversives and the radicals and the revolutionaries who, in the midst of the crazy, continue to put on display a hopeful alternative at high cost. That's where I think this has always flourished. And so, and I mean, global immersion right now, you being one of them, we've got 56 peace fellows across the country, urban, suburban, rural, on the front lines of conflicts all across our country, renovating their institutions into instruments of peace, training their people for everyday peacemaking, exposing their people to conversations like these. Like that's the remnant stuff. That's the
Yeah.
fringe, hopeful alternative stuff. That's where my strategy lives, because that's how I've seen it historically thrive. The last thing I'll say is we just had our recent cohort of leaders in Northern Ireland. And we met with Reverend Harold Good, who I get to interview tomorrow for the Mending Divides podcast. And so tune into this because Harold Good was one of two faith leaders that was invited to observe or witness the final disarmament of the IRA arms in 2005. It was he and Father Alec Reed, so a Protestant and a Catholic faith leaders. And the reason they were selected is because how radically they used their tables to invite folk who on radical extremes to build relationships that eventually created the conditions for peace where people started to go, oh, the way that I'm living my ethic, the way that I'm living my values, the way that I'm living my ideology, it's not only destructive to my enemy, it's guaranteeing that my grandchildren will have to carry guns the rest of their life. That's not the future that I want. Right? So like Harold Good and Alec Reed, they just did this quietly using their own kitchen tables with scones and tea, right? This is how they did the work. I was asking him this very question with our leaders at the Corrymeela community in Northern Ireland, and I just said, Harold, you literally Your neighborhood was literally burning down around you. And this was Christians killing each other. I go, what? How did you maintain your hope in the midst of it? And he said, throughout all of it, I was reminded by my friend, a German theologian named Jürgen Moltmann. He said, Jürgen Moltmann said to me once that Jesus takes the inevitability out of history. That the Jesus that we follow, that I follow, makes impossible things possible. And he's like, as dire and dark and hot and violent as things literally were, I knew that it was not going to have the last word. And I might not see when his neighborhood was burning down, he could never have imagined that he would witness the final disarmament of the IRA arms. He had no imagination for seeing a peace deal, a peace accord built in his lifetime. He had a generational perspective centered on a faith in a Jesus who takes the inevitability out of history. And I think that's become the fuel for me as well, recognizing that the world that I'm working on right now, I'm trying to put sticks in the spokes of violence, don't get me wrong, in all sorts of creative and subversive, mischievous ways. And I'm beginning to think like our indigenous kin around 7 generations from now. The world that I'm working on right now is a world 7 generations from now where our kids can actually be in relationship with one another and care for our planet better and stop killing each other and things like this.
I love that quote. Jesus takes the inevitability out of history. Were it not for his teachings, it would be inevitable that we
Yeah.
would just argue and kill each other
Right.
until there's nothing else.
Right.
And one of the things that gives me hope is that I always think about the track of okay, so you have Christians who were KKK, but then you have King who's a Christian. So there's dark forces within the faith, but there's always a from within the faith that rises up rooted in Jesus
Yeah.
saying, no, that's not the way.
Right.
And you see that time and time again with Christianity. You have this
Mhm.
dominant structure, like just keep with slavery, and then you have Quakers coming in and saying, no, there's a
Mhm.
invisible divine reality, Imago Dei, that God's light lives in all, and so you've got this tension. And that's one of the fascinating parts of Christianity, that you've got this thread of domination, and then you've got this thread of Jesus. And
Mhm.
as you're saying, it was always so.
Mhm.
And so none of this is new. This is just the new wave of it.
Mhm.
And I'm half tempted to say to you and to anyone who's in despair, as you're saying, come on over to the course because the water's fine. Like
Let's
we've got,
go. Yeah. Yeah.
let's go. But at the same time, I want you. This is selfish, but I want you to stay where you are and be the person who reconstructs from the inside out.
Mhm.
And the work that you're doing actually gives me a lot of hope, because you're training the leaders in Christianity who are the disruptors from the
That's
inside
it.
out.
That's it.
And that's the good stuff right
Yeah.
there. And
Yeah.
so stay where you are. You can come over the course, the water's fine, but I love where you are and I love what you're doing, because I think you're taking the inevitability out of
Mm.
this world, and where we see the dominant thread of evangelical Christianity going.
Mm.
So keep
Thank you.
doing what you're doing. Okay, so we're coming to the top of the hour. So I want to ask you a question, practical question for those who are wondering what is theirs to do right now. Again, we can't all go to Pakistan, we can't all
Mhm.
stand in front of ice fans, but what would you say to someone who wants to make a difference but feels overwhelmed because
Mhm.
there's so much division you almost don't even know where to look? Where
Yeah.
would you recommend they start?
Yeah. 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 Look no further than your wingspan. is what I would say. There are movements and alliances underway already, most likely in your cities, that you don't start feel like you got to start something. I would say where there is pain, there are hope dealers bringing things to life. Find them and get in the game because we actually need you in the streets. We actually do need you in the streets. But I would say within your wingspan, there's a couple things that I want to recommend. One, I think like I said earlier, I think the most radical way of life and love and leadership in this moment is to be a bridge builder, is to mend divides between you and that loved one that you don't see eye to eye with, or there's a wounded relationship there. What the world actually needs are folks like us moving toward one another, not shifting the circle of human concern, but expanding it. And I think there's repair work to be done within our wingspan, friends. And I would encourage you to maybe identify what's the wounded relationship in your life that you're still fighting for, and what's the next step in that today? What's the next step you can take in that today? And maybe it's a text that just lets that person know that you're thinking about them, or you miss them, or whatever it is. It's a slow play, right? But I think what the world needs is a lot more of us moving toward our other rather than remaining distant from them. Secondly, coming from the Jesus tradition, I think the most radical teaching of Jesus was enemy love. And Jesus was the only one to ever take anyone beyond neighbor love to enemy love. And my and Emily's mutual friend, Oshita Moore, who leads the leadership cohort with me with Global Immersion, defines in her book, Shalom Sistas, enemy as anyone who exists beyond the reach of your empathy. And I think that that's really, really important for us. That's an important definition. I don't like the thought that I have enemies, but I do according to Oshita's definition. And I think, again, let's be honest and sober about in our humanity, that is real. I would encourage you to interrogate that question. Who exists beyond the reach of your empathy? And number two, what are the fables that you've fabricated about them? Because what's so amazing is we are so eloquent and creative and efficient at fabricating fables about our other or our enemy. And then we're really good at defending the pseudo truths of our fables. And they're never challenged because we never grow proximate to that person to put our fables up against the stories of their lives. And so I think it's important for us right now to acknowledge there are people who live beyond the reach of my empathy. I've got a book of stories about them. I think a first step is just acknowledge that, identify that, and begin to interrogate the book of fables that you have.
As we close, Jer, for those who aren't aware of global immersion, tell us about what it is and what's next for
Yeah.
you. What's your goal for the
Yeah.
organization? Where do you want to take it in
Yeah,
these
for
troubled
15
times?
years, we've been companioning leaders in the Christian space. So not just like clergy, but nonprofit leaders and university leaders and leaders of medical centers and political leaders. It's people who want to be fueled by their faith to leverage their leadership restoratively. So Christian leaders across sectors, and we want to transform them into conflict competent leaders. That's our objective. That's our mission. The way that we do that most specifically is through the cohort experience that Emily spoke of. It's a 6-month program where every year, through a process of application and interview, we bring in 15 to 20 leaders across the country. And we take a 6-month journey that is deeply immersive. And so we're learning from leading voices in global peacemaking, literally through the miracle of technology, bringing the best of the best into the conversation with us, meeting us exactly where we are, and coaching us and training us, raising our capacity for conflict in our own spaces. It culminates in an immersive experience. When Emily was with us, that particular cohort went to the Deep South, where we explored institutional racism and the role of faith leadership in dismantling it. And so that was really the objective of that particular immersion. Last year, as I mentioned, we were in Northern Ireland exploring the reality of sectarian violence, this unholy fusion of faith and politics, and the role of religion to seed violence and the role of faith to disarm it. Right. And we're learning from the contemporary and legacy leaders in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. This year, we'll be going back because the sectarian violence of that place, in many ways, parallels the ideological violence of our own place. And so, like, for example, when Charlie Kirk was murdered, I had some colleagues from Northern Ireland saying, okay, you're now in the place of reciprocal assassinations. We've lived this story. Let me know if you want to talk, right? So they've lived a story that it seems like we're careening toward. And so they become our guides and our mentors for our journey and our leadership here. At the end of the cohort, then our leaders are invited into the Peace Fellowship, where we continue this journey of strengthening the fabric of friendship, deepening our formation, but also a space where collaboration and cross pollination begins to spring to life. So, this kind of thing, what's happening right here, is happening with Peace Fellows across the country, where we're inviting each other in to work with our people and bring to life artifacts and programs that are training other people in the way of peace and reconciliation. So where we're going right now, we have 56 Peace Fellows. And so our theory of change is actually connected to those leaders in the way that they continue to renovate their institutions into instruments of peace, but then train their people for faith-based peacemaking all across the country. One thing that we're paying attention to right now that feels especially important is the divide between the urban and the rural space in the United States, and ensuring that our cohort has rural, urban, and suburban leaders, because we actually need to be working across those lines right now if we're going to actually mend the divides in our country. So yeah, that gives you a peek at least the flagship work that we're doing, and it's really remarkable to watch what's happening with these Peace Fellows as we're standing up radical subversive programming that are training the remnant revolutionaries and the disruptors to walk the way of peace with empathy, compassion, and curiosity.
It's beautiful work that you're doing. And for anyone interested in getting involved with global immersion, I highly recommend that you look them up, look up Journey of Hope, look up Jer. I also think that beyond the people that you're trying to target, which is those who are leaders in organizations who have an influence on others, you're trying to kind of train the trainers, if you will. For anyone who's feeling powerless in this world, take to heart that there is work for all of us to do in being those who can love through conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And so whether you get involved with global immersion or not, the work is being able to love through conflict right now, to be the person who can heal versus create further division.
Yeah.
And that's what we do as course students. The heart, the central teaching of the course is forgiveness. And what we're trying to do is heal the broken world, just like you.
Yeah.
And I think as we do that as individuals, the system broke because we stopped understanding how to get along as individuals. And
Mm-hmm.
so we have to reverse that system, and we
Mm-hmm.
have to learn to get along as
Mm-hmm.
individuals so that it goes upward and the system fixes itself. If enough of us individuals do that, then we can reverse this whole trend.
Let's go.
And it's interesting because, and I'll end on this because I just think this is so amazing how the world works. I'm in England right now, and I was sitting at a restaurant moaning really to Robert, my husband, about how I wanted to go to Corrymeela this year, had registered for it and everything, and didn't get to go because he was in ill health at the time. And I had a woman walk up to me and said, "You're talking about Corrymeela. I've spent years there." So I had a little mini Corrymeela experience,
Yeah.
but so I'm talking about nonviolence. She's a student of nonviolence too, and now we're Facebook friends. And so,
Good.
like, just the more people come
That's it.
together on these kinds of things, that is the change that
That's
heals
right.
our world. I was going to say the slow change. It is slow, but at the same time we need to pick up the pace.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
the work is to become masters of love in our own life, to live the teachings of Jesus in our own life, so that we can go out there and be the people who can heal this place.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's not for any one person, that's for
Oh,
everyone to do. And Jer, you're doing good work. I mean, you're
yeah.
doing
So are
remarkable
you, my
work.
friend.
Thank you for being here. It's an honor to have you here, to call you a friend, and just keep on keeping on, keep the faith.
My pleasure with you, my friend, together.
All right. Bye for now.